So in '82, you begin as a street evangelism ministry. You're working with churches all over the city and neighborhoods like the Lower East Side. Something happened, though, a decade later in 1992, and you planted a church before it was trendy to plant churches in the Lower East Side. Why did you do that?
You know, when we went into the Lower East Side, we wanted to model family and kind of counter the spirit of the community. And after 10 years of working with these folks, and our heart would break because we couldn't do a whole lot for them other than give them the gospel, we decided to create and establish a family dynamic for these folks that didn't have family in the streets. So they became part of the Abounding Grace family. And for us, it was the most glorious time to see these folks who had no hope now have hope.
So what did that look like?
Well, that looked like a whole lot of people. Let's put it this way. They were the ones that nobody wanted and the ones that the cops couldn't do anything with. In fact, one of the things that happened in those early days, there was a gang war that was about to erupt. There was a murder that took place. The cops called me in and they asked me if I could do something with these kids. And I remember I called Mom from the neighborhood there, and I said, honey, I'm going to bring a gang home, make some hot chocolate and sandwiches, and then I brought the gang home. And they watched us. We were able to diffuse the situation. We established relationships with them. And from then on, it opened an opportunity for us to work with the community.
So that's a pretty interesting ministry strategy. You actually bring a gang to your house for a hot chocolate and sandwiches. Your kids are there, your wife is there, and there were no red flags that indicated this might not be a good idea?
No, because where sin abounds, grace does much more abound. And we felt it was time for us, actually back in when we moved into the Lower East Side on 6th Street and Avenue D, we wanted to come in and embody and live out the purposes of God in the community. And for us, it was a natural thing to do.
So grace is present. It goes deep with people. And as it goes deep, I remember an encounter with a gentleman named Cochise, and he had some interesting affiliations. Yeah. Tell us about Cochise and how you got to know him and a little bit of his story.
Well, quickly, Cochise is actually serving time right now. He's been there about 17 years. But back in when we first met, we had set up for a street meeting on Avenue D and 8th Street, and he was walking through with his gang known as the Satan Sinners. They barreled through, and I saw them. They just kind of like very intimidating, very rough group of guys, and I just felt the Lord just drop in my heart, I'm going to give you this gang. So I went after the last guy that had walked by. I turned him around. I said, what's your name? Where are you guys from? And I asked him, who's your president? And he told me. And from that point on, during that week, we began to pray for the Satan sinners. And then on Friday, it was a Friday evening, when we were set up on 4th Street and Avenue D, and we were singing off the flatbed truck. And I tell you, I got up to sing some Spanish corritos, and one of them was Manda Fuego, Señor, and the other ones was No hay Dios tan grande como tú. Manda Fuego, Señor, is God send your fire. And as I completed that song, there was a raging fire that broke out right next to where we were. And then you came over and said to me, Dad, Cochise, the Satan sinners are around the corner. That began a relationship. He eventually, he came, looked me up. We led him to the Lord. I led him to the Lord in prison. And he has now gone through all kinds of chaplaincies. He's filled with the power of God, and he has been an emissary there. I had said to him on the streets one day, Cochise, you're going to serve Jesus. You're going to preach. In prison or out of prison, that's your choice. But God called you to preach. And sure enough, he's been there preaching now almost 17 years.
And so as your relationship with people like Cochise blossomed, I appreciate that your ministry evolved. And it began as a street evangelism ministry. It ultimately led to a church plant. And then in those early days of the church plant, it evolved beyond just traditional church into very holistic kind of community building. Our next guest is a young woman named Enid Almanzar, who we met as part of that chapter in Abounding Grace's development and evolution. And I'm going to welcome her out, and she's going to join in on the conversation. But Enid is a lifelong resident of the Lower East Side. In fact, a fourth-generation Lower East Side resident. And Enid, this picture of a community that Pastor Rick's been describing, I'd love your perspective on it as somebody who was living there throughout this time, very much a part of the dynamics of this community.
Absolutely. For the longest time, the Lower East Side looked nothing like what it looks like today. Today, you see, gentrification happening. You see, businesses. You see clubs. You see little art spots. For a long time, though, there was barrenness. There was gangs. There was drugs, and so it was very difficult living there. My mom was a single mom. On her own. My dad had abandoned us at an early age, and she kept us in all the time because it wasn't safe to go to the parks. It wasn't even safe to go to the store on your own for fear of what can happen. Definitely a very challenging place to grow up.
Can you describe some of those challenges on a personal level in that environment?
No, absolutely. My husband actually grew up in the building next door to us, and when we were 13, when he was 13, actually, he had a run-in with the police, who actually stopped him, and because he mouthed off a little, got a little smart with them, they actually pushed his head into the side of the police car, and because he didn't have a dad either, there was nobody to defend him, and so those were the types of interactions, the people that normally should be, the protectors within your family, within the community, really. There was no one there, or not a whole lot of people there, really to defend those that less fortunate, those that didn't have that strong network.
So, Pastor Rick, as you saw more and more young people like Enid and like her husband and like Cochise, many of whom were fatherless, how did the ministry evolve to integrate that constituency into the lifeblood of Abounding Grace?
Well, we had such an awareness that every one of these children were precious. Every individual, didn't matter where they came from, but everyone was worth the blood of Jesus. And for us, God just poured in our heart the desire to be a mom and dad to these kids. And so our desire was also to not only empower our children, but to be able to share whatever it was. We lived from the principle where Jesus said, freely you have received, freely give. So our desire was to give that which God had given to us. And we wound up taking in 7 kids from outside when we had moved into the community. And they lived with us in technically a 1-bedroom apartment. And you guys had given up your slot so that our girls could be there. And out of that, one of them became our daughter. And we have grandchildren. That's Mei Ling, who was a precious promise that God had given to us. But we've seen such heartache and such turmoil in the kids, but we believe that God has a plan for them, and we wanted to be a vehicle that God can use to empower them.
So on a personal level, on a family level, you're living out this kind of faith, taking kids in. On a ministry level, you also were taking pretty huge risks, empowering teenagers, for example, to start a youth center right in the projects. Mm-hmm. And it was a youth center that you became aware of and ultimately became one of the directors of. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what that was like.
Well, I didn't really understand how big of an impact Generation XL, the youth center you're referring to, was going to have on my life. I had just graduated NYU, and I was getting ready to go to law school, and actually the director from your program had approached me. She said, listen, we're looking for summer interns, and I thought to myself, what a wonderful opportunity to give back to the community, to try something a little different, and that was the summer that changed my life. I didn't really understand why God had allowed me to go through so much. I mean, I came from a family where there was domestic violence. I mean, my stepfather was addicted to crack cocaine. I mean, we were, always struggling for money. And so really had a number of challenges. And for a long time, I was angry at God. I'm like, God, if you're a God of love, if you're a God of sovereignty, why do you allow me to go through these things? And it was that summer at Generation XL that God showed me that I can use those situations to minister to young people, to really speak into the lives of young people who were just like me. And that's what happened. A lot of the young people that walked through our doors, I could spot them right away. I can see God gave me that awareness where I can see that there was an issue and just love on them. Because of the restrictions that we were under being in federal housing projects, I couldn't preach, I couldn't give them a Bible. I just had to love them and be the flesh and bones Jesus that they would come to know. And it was just incredible to be able to speak into their lives and use what were once negative situations in my lives really to show them the grace of God in my own life.
So coming right out of NYU, still a young student, being given this internship opportunity, what kind of leadership lessons did you develop in that sort of an environment?
It's interesting because, again, because we had to be very careful given the location, really not just to talk the talk, but really to walk the walk, that young people really learn more by what you do. I lived in a household where the rule was do as I say, not as I do, which doesn't always work. And so really we had to not tell them about church, not tell them about the gospel, but show them when to feed them. When they were troubled, I had to talk to them. You know, I couldn't tell them about love. I had to hug them and I had to kiss them and I had to not let go sometimes. And when they cried, I had to cry alongside them. And so that required a vulnerability, that required an openness and an honesty that sometimes I think we're a little reluctant to share. And so again, that taught me some important lessons, and truth be told, really set the foundation for my belief system about how to approach ministry.
And what does that look like today?
That exactly as I shared with you. I mean, again, being open and honest and not teaching about grace, but showing. I mean, the example that Pastor Rick shared about bringing the gang to your home, that's pretty bold. But that's the kind of love that the gospel really is showing us. I mean, Jesus didn't do the safe thing. He was a revolutionary. And so those are the types of choices that we're really being required to make. Not the safe choice, not the politically correct choice, but the choice that really is going to embody Christ's love for someone, which isn't always the safe option.
So after being involved in Excel and Abounding Grace for 5 or so years, you made a decision to be part of a church plant as the youth director in that environment. What's that been like? Because one of the things that so excites me about the ministry you're doing at Avenue of Hope is it's around the corner from where you grew up. And so how has that played out for you, being involved in youth ministry so close to your home?
Let me tell you, God has a sense of humor, because when my husband and I got married almost 9 years ago, we made the decision to move a little bit outside of the city. Again, the prices were exorbitant to get any type of real estate, and so we made a conscious decision to move. And so when we were really searching for churches, God led us to a church around the corner from the public housing projects that I grew up in. And so that is the environment that we minister in. And so we're building this thing from the ground up, and again, really following the same lessons that I learned at Generation Excel, just loving on young people. I had an example this summer, for example, of a young person from the community that came. We gave him a club card, an invitation, and he just showed up one day. And he sits in the back of the ministry, he puts his hoodie on and just, crosses his arms, and I wonder, why is this kid here? He doesn't look like he's having a good time. And so we just loved on him. We loved on him and just wouldn't take no for an answer. When he wouldn't show up, I would go knocking on his door, we would call him. And so after, being part of the ministry for about a year, we don't see him for 3 weeks. So I'm calling him, I'm looking for him, and one day he walks back through our doors and he shares with me that his mother had just died of cardiac arrest. And he had been homebound, he didn't know where to go, and he was just ridden with guilt because he was in the following room and he froze. He felt like he could have done more to help his mom, so he had all this guilt on him. And finally, as he decides to emerge from his home, seek help, he comes to us. And so, one, I was freaked out. I didn't know what to do. And I just prayed. I said, God, just let my words be your words. Give me the wisdom to, preach into this young man's life. But I was just so humbled that we had developed such a relationship with him that in his time of crisis, he came to us asking for prayer, asking for, for healing. And so, I mean, again, that only comes through a long-term investment. And again, you're just being real and loving on them.